All right, AP huggers, let's go ahead and backtrack a little bit with a review of the nature and meaning of boundaries. Now, in our discussion of political geography, reminder, a state is separated from its neighbors by boundaries, which are invisible lines that mark the extent of a state's territory and the control its leaders have. Sometimes boundaries are set by physical features like rivers, shores, or mountains, and other times they're drawn into separate ethnic groups from each other. Boundaries may be negotiation or at war with its neighbors, which also leaves a state open to changes in the future. Boundaries completely surround an individual state to mark its outer limits, giving it a distinctive shape. Because boundary lines mark the place where two or more states come in direct contact, they have the potential to create conflict. Now, just to review in terms of the types of boundaries we've already read about in our key issues. Number one, kind of mentioned already, physical boundaries. Physical boundaries are very easy to see, both in Raleigh and on maps, so they often make good boundaries. Mountains limit contact between nationalities living on opposite sides, and they're usually sparsely populated. Desert boundaries are common in Africa and Asia, and although their exact location isn't easily spotted in reality, they generally provide a reliable and relatively permanent boundary to go by. Now, cultural boundaries between some states are set by ethnic differences, especially those based on language and or religion. Cultural boundaries are also called consequent boundaries. One example of a boundary based on religion was that one that was partitioned from Pakistan and India in 1947. The borders for the new state of Pakistan were drawn around the Muslim portions of the subcontinent in an effort to try to keep or separate the Muslims from the Hindus. The partition did little to actually fix the problems between the two religions. And in some cases, it made it worse because some people, if they were actually on the wrong side or the opposite side of the line, they had to struggle and actually migrate to basically reposition themselves on the correct side of the border. Language boundaries have also been very important in Europe since cultural identities have been based on language. Again, the lines are not easy to be set. The boundary between France and Germany shifting back and forth within a population with mixed heritage. After World War I, the Allied leaders tried to redraw the map of Europe based on the ethnic lines. This was at the Treaty of Versailles. For example, they carved out a large empire of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire into small ethnically based states. Little states, or states like Hungary or Romania or Poland was carved out of this Treaty of Versailles. The Balkans were united under a new country known as Yugoslavia, which fell apart in the 1990s into several smaller ethnically based countries, a process referred to as Balkanization. The Balkans illustrate a tendency for mountain ranges to form what we call shatter belts, or zones of great cultural complexity containing many small cultural groups who find refuge in isolations created in rough terrain. Shatter belts are often areas of cultural tension that may spread to other areas. Sometimes geometric boundaries are set between countries. These are straight imaginary lines that generally have good reason for their creation. For example, in class we watched the movie on Behind the Line of North Korea. North and South Korea are divided during the early Cold War by the 38th parallel, which chose to demark or marcate on the map the communist side versus the side that's aligned with US control. The method was also used in Vietnam when the country was split on the 17th parallel to separate the north, controlled by Hanoi, and from the south, controlled by Saigon. Now, a little more on boundaries on the right side. We also mentioned in class you have notes, lecture notes in your key issue. Antecedent boundaries are boundaries placed before the cultural landscape develops. In other words, before there's actually people that settle there. Subsequent boundaries are drawn from the cultural landscape is in place, when the cultural landscape is in place, And consequent boundaries are a type of boundary that are drawn to accommodate the existing language, religious, or other cultural boundaries. Superimposed boundaries are sometimes forced on existing boundaries, as in the case of Africa at the Berlin Conference by European colonial powers during the 19th century. The last one we mentioned in class were relic boundaries, are old boundaries that are no longer used in countries and now non-existent boundary. For example, the relic boundary we mentioned was the Great Wall of China, which was built during the 3rd century and is a defensive border to repel the invading Mongols from the north. The last area of boundaries I want to review with you guys is the boundary disputes, because that's for a lot of you, you're referencing or you're researching one particular boundary dispute or perhaps a territorial dispute. So a couple quick reminders in terms of the 4 types that you guys read about. Number 1, we have what's called positional disputes, and that occurs when states argue about where a border actually is. For example, the United States and Mexico actually fought for years over their mutual border, even after it was set officially by the treaty in 1848, after the result of the Mexican-American War. The boundary between Argentina and Chile has been controversial because it follows the crest of the Andes Mountains and the watershed, which do not always coincide. Second one we read about is territorial disputes. They often come around when the ownership of a region, usually around mutual borders, conflicts arise when people in one state want to try to take over or annex a territory whose population is ethnically related to them. War between Mexico and the United States broke out, such as Texas and California, where many U.S. citizens had resettled, and yet the Mexican government controlled the land space. So we had Texas trying to fight the war and actually wanted to start their independence. This expansionism, called irredentism, a 20th century example is the German invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland and areas with German minorities. We mentioned before Hitler was trying to get all the German-speaking people. He wanted to create what he called the Third Reich, which was a German empire. He believed that the Germans were destined for greatness. He wanted to create that pure Aryan race. So territorial disputes, often again, a lot of conflict and causes for war. The third type you read about was resource disputes. Involve natural resources, for example, mineral deposits, fertile farmland. We know how important that is, and with our agricultural unit. Also ocean fishing groups. For example, the United States and Canada have fought over fishing areas and grounds in the Atlantic Ocean. The spark for the Persian Gulf War in the 1990s was a dispute or a conflict between Iraq and Kuwait regarding rights to oil. One could definitely argue with climate change, resources like water, for example, might possibly be another area for disputes in years to come. And then finally, the last one I want to review with you guys is the functional dispute, which arrives when neighboring states cannot agree upon policies that apply in a border area. An example will be the ongoing debate between Mexico and the United States regarding the transport of people and goods across their long mutual border. The United States has generally wanted stricter controls put on immigration from Mexico. Again, we've mentioned before with our population unit and movement, United States candidates for president even going so far as trying to argue that we need a larger wall or a taller border or fence, so to speak. And they've also pressured the Mexican government to control drug trafficking across the border. And then last but not least, as you guys review, you should also go through your notes and your key issues and just briefly review our discussion of creating official boundaries. And we mentioned there are 4 main steps to create an official boundary. The first being to define, where actually you sit down and negotiate and figure out where the border should be. Delimitation is where you're actually going to mark it, put it on the map, define it. Remember, if it's on a map, it must be true. Our third step is demarcation, where we create a landmark, or we build a fence, or we draw a line, or something to clearly mark where the border starts, where it begins, where sovereignty rights, where the government has control over the area. And then finally, stage 4 would be administration. Administration is where we actually make sure that there's checkpoints and there's means to make sure the border laws and rules are enforced. All right, AP Hug team, that was just a brief review of some of our discussion of borders and boundaries. Make sure you guys are reviewing this and make sure you have this information in your key term cards. All right, hashtag AP Hug Life. See you guys later.